What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and I'm super excited for today's show and know that you guys will be too. I am sitting here today with my new friend, Matty, who I actually met off Twitter. And he was incredibly inspiring to me when I first came across him. I found his account. I'm not sure exactly how, but it came up in my feed. And I saw this fantastic thread that he made about Satanism and the history behind the occult systems, the Illuminati, Freemasons. And since then, he's just had amazing feedback from survivors, activists, and his content has been shared widely. And I knew that he was somebody that had to come on the show and explain to you guys some of what he's been learning in his research. Matty is a California native who's a self-taught historian specializing in the occult systems and secret societies. And he's actually working on a documentary, which will be out this summer, that maybe he'll give you guys a little bit of details about, maybe not, but that'll be coming pretty soon. So you guys also have that to look forward to. Matty is also an athlete, bodybuilder, aspiring MLB pitcher. And I call him a dog whisperer to his new little doggy, which is so cute. He made a cute little post on Twitter with his sweet little dog and was asking people to help with the name. And he's just awesome. Matty is going to explain to you guys today. We're going to do a series of podcasts. So this will be one of a couple episodes or a few. We're going to see how it goes today and see where it leads off for next time. But we're going to actually break down some of the history that Matty's been learning and teaching himself these last few years. And we're going to start today with him introducing himself a little bit more and explaining to you guys how he got into some of this stuff. So Matty, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really been looking forward to this since I think it was November he reached out to me. And it was just really shocking, I guess, for me, because I started this journey, I guess, like a little over a year ago, and I never really expected that anybody would ever pay attention. I kind of just did it because I thought it was interesting, but 6 months later, here we are. So I'm really excited to be here. You touched on a lot of stuff about me,
Especially the dog whisperer part.
yeah, he's downstairs. He's a great little dog. I'm very happy to have him. He's not little. Oh, I know. He's big, but I love dogs. It's good to have one in the home and keeps me sane.
Oh my gosh, they're the best, especially when you're surrounded by this type of material, or if you're digging into it. It can get really heavy and they don't know. They're never heavy. They're just always so happy. So they're so comforting too, to have their love around and just their happy energy, you know?
Yeah. Oh, the levity is so much better because it's like, at a certain point of reading, my brain just kind of gets a little fried and, he just looks at me the same way. He just kind of perks his ears up and, he has no idea what I'm thinking, but he lays his head on my leg and all is right in the world. So I'm very thankful for him.
Yeah. And they ask no questions. Usually people are like, what's wrong? And sometimes it's hard to just, regurgitate what you've learned. Sometimes you just want something there to just comfort you and love you, regardless of how you're feeling. And going back to what you were saying, like I said, I don't know how you came up in my feed. I should have paid more attention, but that was a while ago. And when I saw that thread and then went to your profile, I couldn't believe that somebody your age was talking so in depth about a topic that most adults won't even get into looking into, researching, or even know exists to research. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to this point and kind of your life leading up to now and what got you into this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that you said earlier that I think is the most important detail is that I'm self-taught, which is, I don't want to say an understatement, but let's just say that my background in formal history is essentially non-existent. But I was an only child. I am an only child. I was adopted. So I spent a lot of days at home, passing the time. And so my parents gave me a lot of books. So I would just sit at home and read, sometimes the encyclopedia, maybe some things that would be more fun. But I've just always had a real taste for knowledge. I've always been a really curious kid. And that led to eventually like being on the internet, just going down the rabbit hole on whatever, at 12, 13 years old.
Wow.
because it's fun, and it might not have been anything serious, it might not have been anything helpful,
Yeah.
but at a very young age I had the idea that I could figure out whatever I wanted if I just kept looking. And so I've always had a habit of reading, I've always had a habit of searching, and I mean I've always been open to mysteries. My dad grew up, or when I grew up, my dad would read me like the Hardy Boys books, which are all about those two guys looking for mysteries and ghosts and all of that. So I probably developed a taste for it somewhere along the lines. As far as actual harder topics, I think I definitely kind of found out about it maybe when I was in high school around that time. And you only learn about surface level stuff about, I probably watched the History Channel and saw Ancient Aliens or whatever documentary about the Da Vinci Code or any sort of these things. And I've always been, since I kind of started watching those things, I've had the seed planted that like, we can't be told the whole truth, which is a heavy thing for like a kid in high school to kind of come to, but I did come to it.
I didn't come to that in high school. I didn't know many kids that did. I just think it's amazing that you were able to think that way so young.
Yeah. And I mean, it's kind of, I guess it's like weird to think of it this way, but I think it was from an extreme naivety that I bought into these kind of really foolish things. But in a certain way, I guess it's not naive because it was me forming my own opinions. It was the weakest form of critical thinking, but it was critical thinking. So anyway, I get to college. I was playing college baseball at the time, and so to pass the time, my friends and I would watch, same kind of things, whatever documentary about aliens on Netflix, and that continued to grow my appetite. But by my senior year of college, so this would be about,
how long ago was college for people who might not know how old you are?
yeah. So I graduated last May.
Okay.
So I'm 23. So my senior year, I went to school for 5 years, so the timeline will be rough. Just track with me here.
Sure.
But March of 2020, our season gets canceled. We go home. Everybody's home because of COVID. I was living in California at the time, so not going outdoors, not doing anything.
And it was rough in California, much worse than a lot of other states too.
Yeah, I mean, it still is.
Yeah.
It's a different country. Anyway, I had a lot of time to kind of just sit and reflect, as we all did. And you spend enough time watching and observing what people say and what happens and narratives in the news and things that just don't really seem right. And, a lot of people started wondering, doesn't really seem like we're all being told the truth.
Did you kind of know that right away? Or because a lot of people in your state were very, captivated by the news that they were told. And that was a big state. California is extremely brainwashed as a whole. So that had to have been extra hard for you to sift out through the narrative when it seems like everybody around you probably was sucked into it.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll be honest, like the first certain period of COVID, maybe the first month, let's say, I couldn't help but be sucked in too. I mean, at a certain point, I was like, oh, wow. I mean, maybe the world is going to end. I mean, which is funny, really funny to like look back now, because like 2 years ago, it's like, I thought I was crazy then, maybe I'm crazy now. I don't know what the difference is, but I definitely bought into a lot of the hype. And when you see it melt away so fast, I think that was the first thing. I mean, I've always been skeptical.
Yeah.
I think as long as I've lived, I think probably my parents instilled that in me. I don't know. But the thing that really, really aggravated it was the Jeffrey Epstein case. And I think it's really important, at least in my story, to note there's kind of always that cliche. I mean, to people who watch your show, it's not a cliche, and I don't mean to make it one, but for maybe more normal, not normalish people, but normies, right? People that live in the matrix of
mainstream propaganda. Yeah,
exactly. There's kind of the cliche of like, oh, the satanic pedophile elite, and they kind of do it in big dramatic letters to make you look as insane as possible. but I was like, oh my God, it's real. It's like, oh, and he's meeting with this person and he's meeting with this person. And there's a picture of him here with this symbol. And like, you know, I don't think of myself as someone who's, I'm not super observant, but it's like, I feel like anybody that's half awake could see, wow, something's clearly going on. And I mean, it was not covered obviously in the realm that it should have been. And then he dies in his cell. And it's ruled a suicide and all that.
Cameras
And
are off.
yeah, it's like, it's just such an asinine series of details. And a quick aside, it's so funny. I think a really good way to look at this whole thing is that the news and the people who watch it, it's such an abusive relationship. I mean, it's like you're so deconditioned to notice such obvious symbols. Like in a relationship, it's like you say, when there's smoke, there's fire. And you see this thing doesn't add up and this thing doesn't add up and this thing doesn't add up. And it's like, okay, well, there's clearly a reason for this. But in terms of world events, we're so deconditioned that like any single thing we see, it's covered and there's never a spark of curiosity. And I just didn't have that. So, that was, I don't remember what month it was. It was sometime during the summer. Eventually we went back to school and I just couldn't return back to normal life. I was like, this is a lie. This is very clearly evidence of a major lie being perpetrated against us. I don't know what to do, but I have to do something. And I kind of just like reopened my kind of really long-term curiosity for lack of a better term, conspiracies. And I was just like, let's indulge. So I went and found as many, as many sources as I could find. And that leads you down at the surface level, a lot of really kind of foolish trails. But I remember the first thing I watched that really kind of started to get my gears turning was a really, really old Alex Jones documentary that he did in 2002 called 9/11 Road to Tyranny. And I mean, it's very oddly done. And I mean, Alex Jones was just a kid at the time. It was, horrible and all over the place in a certain sense, but it just blows your mind, the things that you learn about an event that, it's like 20 years ago, we kind of still think of it in the public eye, like, oh, that wasn't that long ago. You know what I mean? Like we all knew it happened, but the amount of things you don't know about it are unbelievable.
And you're so caught up in like fear and trauma that you just accept what the news tells you because you want some type of a resolution and like you want to know details. So you take that and it's like, okay, they have to be telling the truth. Nobody would lie about an event like this, and then you move on with your life. And then every year that passes, that's like you're re-traumatized, but you relive that same narrative instead of ever asking, like you said, being like, could there have been a second side to the story or a third side of the story or something they may not have told us?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it was I was back at school living with 5 roommates in a house at the time, 5 of my teammates. And it was a really interesting proving ground because I'd be watching these different documentaries and I'd just be kind of asking them questions about these events or telling them things. And, I'd say, for example, something like, hey, did you ever know that, for example, George Bush, his family, and the Bin Laden family were business partners going back to the 1970s. Did you ever consider that as like evidence of foul play? And they would just kind of say, wow, I didn't know that. And I'd say, like, does that change anything for you? Does that make you reevaluate, the coverage of this event? And they'd go, not really. And, I just like, besides being baffled, my conclusion would just kind of be like, well, I guess you can't save anybody, really. You can't convince somebody who's made their mind up that they don't want to have it changed. And I mean, I did it for a while, in so many different domains with whatever thing. And eventually I just got so tired of it because I knew 2 things, which is that it was so obvious that we're being lied to on so many different fronts. And it's so obvious that we should be lied to because people are so naive that they no longer deserve the truth.
And they don't even ask for it, right? So you can do it now and people don't even question it.
Right.
Did your friends think you were crazy?
I've never asked them because I've just accepted that
Yeah,
they can think I'm crazy and their opinion doesn't matter.
sure.
And I don't mean that in a nasty way. I just mean that in this specific domain, it's such a bad relationship that they have with the truth that they can think of me however I want. I know who I am as a person.
I love that.
Um, and at the end of the day, it's like, I'm a 22, 23-year-old guy. Like, we're all a little chaotic in one way or another. At the end of the day, we're all going to have each other's backs. So it never factored into my friendship. It just factored into my
Great.
relationship that I had with the world.
Yeah, I love that. That's great.
So, I got home, living in a new state. I'm talking to my parents. I'm telling them kind of these things that I've learned. And my dad, he's just so bewildered. And I mean, cut him some slack, I came home and I just probably sounded psychotic. I'm telling him like, and this thing about 9/11, and this thing about like the UFOs are fake and this and that all at once. And he's just can't even catch up all at once. But to cut him some slack even more, we started watching all these more documentaries. We go to the bookstores. And eventually I stumbled upon this book called Behold a Pale Horse by Milton William Cooper, which,
With that book, I love that book.
so, you know what it looks like. You see it in Barnes and Noble. It's got a really funky cover with the skeleton. And, I mean, I don't know how, but it was displayed on the front case. So like I would see it every time. And finally I picked it up and you read the back and it's talking about New World Order, fake aliens, concentration camps. And it just hit me at the right time in my life that I was like, yep, I'm ready. So I open the book, I bring it home, and it's unlike anything I've ever experienced in my entire life. William Cooper, the guy who wrote it, truly, as well as I do, in the world of conspiracies, there's many shysters, for lack of a better term. There's many con men. There's many people who create false publicity. William Cooper is the exact opposite of that. He was a decorated Navy captain during the Vietnam War. He was run off the road by government agents. He lost his legs because of a car accident. Bill Clinton called him the most dangerous radio host in America in a private White House memo. And he was talking about things I'd never considered in my life. He's doing research on presidential executive orders. He's calling generals on the phone, and he's like the standard of research at the time that people were doing. He didn't just go above and beyond it. It was not in the same world. And I mean, even today, like I can only hope to get to that level myself.
Even have the technology that we do. Like,
Yeah.
think about what he did and found out without all of our resources just blows my mind.
I think my favorite in particular Bill Cooper anecdote that I just learned recently was that he started from nothing, and he was like, I need people to know this stuff that I found out. So he started writing a bunch of letters, handwriting them with all these information that he wrote into like a pamphlet. And he just got a bunch of lists of people's names and just sent them across the world. He paid like for $30,000 worth of postage, $30,000 in like 1990, and was just sending these pamphlets to random people's houses. And that's how he made a name for himself, which is like so insane, inconceivably insane, but a testament to his grit. I don't know if that's the right word, but someone who in truth was willing to die for their cause. And when I found out that he was shot dead by police in front of his house, I was like, this is it.
And now you have to wonder, like, I question that narrative. He's not here to tell the truth. Nobody else was there to see, I'm like, what exactly did happen? Is it how the story told, or is there details that they might have left out of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the from the police reports that were filed, which are, I mean, I guess you could either say they're laughably honest or they're really shockingly redacted, because the police basically admit that and I mean, he lived out in the sticks, out in the middle of the desert of Arizona. They basically late at night pretended like they were high schoolers partying out in this field near his house, so knowing that he would come out, and they basically ambushed him, chased him back to his house, tried to arrest him, and then got into a gunfight and killed him. It was about, I think it was 7 cops, um, for tax evasion, by the way. Uh, yeah, yeah. Not too many people in history have the rare privilege of being shot to death for tax evasion. So, I mean, I think if you're any person who has any bit of self-respect about being intelligent, you see that when a conspiracy host is shot to death in front of his house for tax evasion, you know he must have been onto something. So he did a radio series called The Hour of the Time, which he would do on shortwave radio. And I found some old copies of it on YouTube. And I used to just listen to them religiously in my car. Anywhere I would go, to the gym or, the grocery store, even if it was just 20 minutes. He did this one series in particular. It's about a 40-hour series called Mystery Babylon, where he talks about everything that I cover. Paganism, the New World Order, Freemasonry, the Illuminati, Roshania, all of it. And he details it A to Z. And it's my personal belief that it's the greatest single series done by any conspiracy researcher ever. And I don't think it'll ever be beaten. If there are, if you can get your hands on it, you should. It'll change your life. It changed mine. You listen to 40 hours of a guy talking about how you've been lied to and reading you excerpt after excerpt of book that's 300 years old, 500 years old, et cetera, et cetera. You don't really come away from that unchanged. So after that, I was like, nobody knows this stuff, I guess, except me now. I guess I better keep researching. It seems like I did feel a personal sense of calling. And so I started researching, undertaking some projects, made plans for a documentary with a friend. And so I've never stopped from there. I just kind of undertook any project I could find. I never planned to write about it until I did by accident last June, and it got a ton of traction. I just kind of made one long Twitter thread of like everything, like kind of, even if it was foolish, fun fact that I could think of that would just go against conventional history narratives. And it worked. So I was like, I guess
I saw it. And you said that was in November, right? Like I met you in November. You published that months before, and it somehow circulated in my Twitter in November. It went so far. There's so many people that were engaging and sharing that, and they're still sharing it, which is incredible.
Well, it's really funny because I remember it was like June. And I'd now been listening and researching and doing all this stuff for like 6 or 7 months, every day, nonstop, hours a day. And I finally was like, maybe I should post about this. And a friend was over at my house. We were at the beach, and I asked him, because I'd been talking to him about this stuff for months and, like kind of shocking him in a certain way. And I was so against it. I was like, nah, I can't, it's dumb. Like, it's not me. There's no audience for it. And I did it. And it was it's still the most successful thread I've ever released, even though I think that I don't mean to be my worst critic, although I'll never get out of that. But it's like, I mean, there's errors in spelling. There's, it doesn't center on any one thing. So many of the facts I feel like are so pedestrian compared to like some of the work I'm doing these days. And I still have much to gain, but it was successful. And so I was like, okay, I guess I can do this. I stumbled onto the topic of Satanism really by accident. There's a guy named David McGowan, who is a conspiracy researcher. He runs this website. Well, he's dead now, but it was called centerforaninformedamerica.com. And he would write about everything, Lincoln assassination, 9/11, the moon, whatever. And I mean, everybody listening, you should check out centerforaninformedamerica.com. David McGowan is, if it's not Bill Cooper, he's the greatest conspiracy researcher of all time. But what he did before he died of cancer in 2015, was he left a reading list of all these books on all these different topics, and basically just said, like, check this out for this reason, check this out. And I mean, it was so many different categories. I mean, he had 10 books on MK Ultra, everything about the connections to Nazism in the United States, um, things about government overreach. But at the bottom was this whole thing about Satanism. And I was so shocked because, I mean, I was still somewhat outside of that realm. And I didn't even really consider it to be an area of intrigue because, like, until you understand the history and see what you're not being told, Satanism is kind of just portrayed as it's like a shaved head teenager playing the electric guitar behind the Blockbuster or something like that. It's made to be really juvenile.
Or even
um
like the goth people, like all black hair in their face and black lipstick, and
yeah.
it's like, nope, that's might be part of it. There are people that look like that, but that's not what it is.
Yeah, and I mean, so I scrolled down and I remember I think I was on like a road trip or something like that. I was just like trying to find something to read when I was sitting in a hotel again or something. But I remember seeing these books that talked about this phenomenon called satanic ritual abuse. And I was like, never heard of that. And they talk about, like, he'd say words like epidemic and systemic and government cover up. And I'm like, that seems like a very tall order to prove, like any person who might not know a thing, you're just maybe prone to believing that sounds like a little bit too much sensationalism. But I started looking at the books and, he would write like how available they are. And every one of the books in the list, it would be like, no more copies circulating. This author was sued for libel. The last known copy of this book was stolen from a library. So like there's like 5 books. And I mean, I've gotten all of them now except one. And I finally, after a year, have found out who the author was, and I'm going to reach out to him and try and get a copy of this book. But all these books were like, basically, you can't get them. That's the bottom line. You can't buy these books, or if you can, they might be like $700 on eBay. But there was one in particular called Children for the Devil by Tim Tate. This book, you can't buy it. It's not on the internet. So I searched for hours and I finally, thanks to God, found a PDF of it for free online. And if anybody wants it, shoot me a DM. I'll send it to you. You should.
If you want to, you can send it to me and I'll put it in your show notes for this episode.
Cool. But Tim Tate was an investigative journalist who wrote about sex trafficking. And he's been doing it for, I think, since like the 80s. This book came out in 91. But he's a very fair journalist. He said, I kept hearing about this phenomenon, and keep in mind, he's plugged into the sex trafficking community. He's already investigating it. So it's not like he's just any guy on the street. And he says, I kept hearing about it. I wasn't sure. A lot of people said that it was insane, but I wanted to be fair and I wanted to check it out. So he's an English writer, and he was talking, to so many kids, like children who dealt with these things, talking to their parents, asking them questions, finding out their stories. And I mean, it's like the same day I found out this was a real thing, I'm hearing about these stories and they're just horrifying. I don't need to tell you that because and everybody watching this knows, but they're horrifying stories. Shook me to my core. I was driving wherever I was, somewhere across the country, and I was just sitting there speechless in my car. I was like, I thought I was going to throw up. And I'm like calling my friends and I'm like, you're not going to believe these things I'm finding out. It makes me sick to my stomach. And nobody believes them. Nobody believes the kids. Nobody believes the parents. The courts, they're ruling that there's no evidence.
And then there was the satanic panic too, that everybody it still buys into today. That still pops up when this stuff leaks out.
Yeah. And so, I read that and I was like, it's so funny because, like, in a really grim way, but I never had a single moment after I read that book. And I mean, I read it in like 2 days. It's like, it's a big book too. I mean, I read a lot, but I read this one fast. There was never a moment where I was like, I'm unsure about this. Like I was like, I got to tell people about this. I need to know everything about this. I need to become the smartest person in the world on it if that's possible. And I need to figure out where it's coming from so people can know and we can do something about it, because it's so heinous. It's the most heinous phenomenon on earth. There's no question. Again, I don't need to tell you that, but
That layer breaks people's souls when they listen. It's like human trafficking, kidnapping. People have an idea of what that could look like, but it doesn't traumatize them psychologically and break them open to care as much as I think SRA does. I think SRA, when you actually learn about it, that's what I have found with people like you and I that are on the outside kind of looking in and studying and being like, oh, what is human trafficking? What is this satanic stuff? When you learn about that layer, that I think changes people to where there's that element of, how can I not care about this? Like, this is freaking serious, what is going on, and people don't know about it. And I'm not saying that's the case for everybody, but I have noticed that SRA seems to be kind of a breaking point for people like us. When we learn about that, that's when it's like, the veil really comes off and you experience something emotionally and psychologically that changes you differently than just, and I don't want to say just trafficking,
of
but it's
course,
like I said, it's that layer of it is deeper than trafficking, even though a lot of trafficking victims also go through this. It's just not, it's inconceivable for somebody like us to even consider that that could be real, much less, understanding that 99% of the world couldn't even possibly grasp their mind around believing something like that.
yeah, I mean, yeah. I'm almost kind of like reliving it now, because it truly, like when you kind of put yourself in that place of not knowing and then being forced to know. And again, I'm not trying to make this about me, because it's not, but the point is that there's no going back when you find out it's real. And obviously the scale for people that experience that, I don't experience it, I only hear about it, but it's an infinite amount greater. But I knew, okay, I needed to know, and it's a problem that we need to figure out, because you hear about, uh it's happening on such a great scale, and because it's happening on such a great scale, no one believes it. And I already kind of touched on the thing about, okay, we know the satanic pedophile elite is real, but now you're like, it's not just real, it's spot on. And if it's that spot on, why don't we know about it? And why don't we know why it's happening, and why don't we know why they're doing specifically what they're doing? And all of these questions just start popping up everywhere all at once. And so I spent, I don't even know, probably 9 months researching it, just getting my hands on every single book I could find. And I mean, there's some excellent ones, I mean, the books that came out during the satanic panic, quote unquote, that were done by journalists much more brave than I, because again, they're the ones getting knives to their throat, being told, don't look into this anymore. But there was some fantastic pieces of work. Another book that I want to quickly just drop some love on is Cover Up the Century by Daniel Ryder. Another book done by someone who was on the ground researching satanic ritual abuse during the original, I guess you would say, appearance of it in the public consciousness. Another book I will send to Emma for anybody who wants it. But basically, you kind of arrive at a point when you study these things enough that you realize, okay, this is not a 1980s phenomenon. This is not a American phenomenon or a European one. It is a world phenomenon, and is it a phenomenon much older than anything. And that's I mean, I wrestle with it every day. I've been, and it's not funny, but it's there's certain truths in this world that are beyond the understanding of a single person. And so it kills me, because to know that these sorts of things have been existing for 7,000 years, that evil, and I mean, that's your ultimate realization, is that it's evil. It's just evil at its very core. It is the manifestation of evil, and it goes back to the dawn of time where evil was spawned. I guess we can kind of segue to the history now, because we've talked about a lot of the antecedents leading up to it.
Yeah, I was going
Um,
to ask you about that. If you could talk about what was happening 7,000 years ago.
yeah. So, I think the way that I want to talk about this, I want to talk about a really kind of recent example, and I can kind of work you back
Yeah,
from there.
perfect.
Um, so let me just make a quick distinction real quick. For those that you know, for sake of clarification, when we're talking about Satanism, we're not talking about Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan. We're not talking about Lucian Greaves and the Satanic Temple. We're talking about real Satanism. We're talking about real black magic, real demons. Okay. Lucian Greaves is a fraud, and unless he's secretly really into Satanism and doing that behind the scenes, I'm not throwing that possibility out. But their church is, for all intents and purpose, a money-making scheme. Real Satanism, Michael Aquino, Temple of Set, that is real Satanism. Okay, people that are students of black magic. So I don't know if you've covered the Presidio daycare ritual abuse scandal. Okay, so I think it was about the 1980s. Presidio military base in San Francisco. Children started showing signs of being sexually abused. I'm obviously going to not get into the details of that, but they're showing the signs, and they're all children that are being held at a military daycare base. And upon investigation, they're finding that massive amounts of children are being abused. And children in particular are pointing to this one man. They can recognize him on the spot. That's Michael Aquino. I believe he was a major in the Army. He was the head of psychological operations in the Army. He's very highly decorated. Okay, this is not some boot. Okay, he's very well respected. And these children are a child in particular. I think, if I remember correctly, it was spawned because a child and her mother ran into them somewhere in San Francisco, and the child started crying and saying, like, that's Mikey, that's Mr. Mikey, get me away from him, he hurts me. Anyway, long story short, investigations go into the military base. They find an altar in a shed. They find a dummy of a human body that's made to look like a real body. It's being mutilated. They find satanic graffiti. They find pentagrams, all the signs of satanic rituals. Children are able to go to Michael Aquino's house. They're able to, from memory, tell you what's going on, what it looks like. Okay, it's black. There's kind of a weird statue here. There's, they know what it looks like. Police go into Michael Aquino's house. They find a soundproof room in the basement. Obviously not there by coincidence. And so they take him to trial. A lot of people at the daycare are, if I remember correctly, convicted. Michael Aquino was never convicted. But the record-keeping building for the military base burnt down during the trial. Michael Aquino never served a day in jail. And I mean, people in that Army base were admitting there's a satanic cult here on this base and nobody's doing anything about it. The point is not about the case. The point is that he's a satanic priest, in a very real, he's dead now, by the way, thank God for that, but a very real satanic cult. And it's not, this is not a joke. Not that people think it is, but I'm just trying to drive home the seriousness about their enterprise. So you can start there. And they, by the way, have a public web presence. They have a website. You can join them. They will send you a pamphlet in the mail. And you can go to their website and see what they believe. And it's not exactly what you would expect. So the first distinction I want to make, after making the distinction that Satan is real, magic is real, is that our understanding of Satan as a society is very narrow-minded, and I don't want to say outdated, because it's, if anything, it's not, it's the opposite. It's that it's too modern. It's that it's an ancient phenomenon that we don't understand, and because we don't understand it, we can't approach it effectively. So a little bit of background about the Temple of Set. They're called the Temple of Set and not the Temple of Satan because their god, quote unquote, is Set, who is an Egyptian god, ancient Egyptian god in the Egyptian pantheon, one of their gods who's specifically chaotic, who specifically believes in the morality of self, meaning being able to define your own rules. And if you go to their website, it's kind of cryptic, I guess you would say, to like someone, if you don't know what to look for. But if you do a little digging ahead of time, you realize it's a classic Gnostic belief. It's not quote unquote Satanism. They don't talk about Satan. They don't associate with Satan, because whether or not you're dealing with a goat with horns or an alligator or an ancient Sumerian god with tentacles, that's not the point. The point is that they're initiated in ancient Babylonian mysteries that go back to the beginning of time. So basically what I'm trying to get at here is that the Temple of Set is what is called a Gnostic sect. And so Gnosticism is a bit of a complex beast. But basically what it is it's a conglomeration of the ancient mysteries of Mesopotamia, or Babylon, for, I guess, a more clear term, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, Persia, various schools, but they all believe the same thing, which is that through knowledge of self, you can transcend, you can define your own morals, and you can become your own god. Now, I mean, that's Satanism in a nutshell, but Satanism is that, in other words, that Satanism is just an articulation of that with a different mascot. And so Gnosticism, it's classically understood to be like a kind of a mystical way of interpreting Christianity, but in actuality, what it is that it's ancient pagan beliefs using Christian characters to get a satanic end. So like one of the kind of the founding scholars of Gnosticism was named Simon Magus, and he's I believe he's in the book of Acts. I believe Peter meets him in the book of Acts. He was a magician, and one of the things Simon Magus said about Gnosticism was that it was a revolt against the God of this world and his morality to transcend. And so that is what Gnosticism is. That people will tell you that it's no, it's you're actually just learning like secrets about Jesus or secrets about Moses or any sort of these things. It's not that. What Gnosticism is in a nutshell is the belief that humans were created by God, who wanted to keep us ignorant. Satan, when he offered Eve the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, he was setting us free from our ignorance. And so the Gnostic ethos is effectively that Satan is good, that God is bad. There's Gnosticism, again, it's not its own church. There's no Gnostic Pope because it's not a real thing. It's a mix of doctrines. So there's going to be some variations, but that is it in a nutshell. And that is the foundation for Satanism of, the past 2000 years. It's God is bad, Satan is good. Effectively, Satan gives me the knowledge to become a god in myself. I don't mean to whittle it down so simplistically, but that is it in a nutshell. And the one thing that I guess I should just hit upon now while I'm thinking about it is, I touched on the fact that Gnosticism is a mix of all these beliefs and you get one belief. The bottom line of that is that all of these beliefs actually emanate from one place, and that's Babylon. So basically you have the Old Testament, you have Noah, right? Noah in the ark. He has a son named Ham. His son Ham has a son named Nimrod, and Nimrod organized the first city. People were living out in the wilderness at that time, and Nimrod said, why don't we all live together to protect ourselves from these wild animals? He was a great hunter, and therefore people respected him. He was the first real king. Nimrod commissions the Tower of Babel. By the way, Nimrod means, it comes from the root Murad, which means the one who rebelled. That's important because he's the first more or less human to rebel against God. When he commissioned the building of the Tower of Babel, that was his way of him becoming a god himself. Nimrod eventually died, and he was enshrined as a god known as Baal, which is the golden calf of the Old Testament that the people worship when the Israelites are out in Egypt. That god Baal eventually became known as the Greek god Pan, which is, if you know anything about Pan, you can just Google him. He's the goat with the horns. Pan was worshipped in a temple called the Temple of Mendes. Many people know the goat that represents Satan as the goat of Mendes. So after Babylon, many people scatter out of Mesopotamia. They go to Egypt, they go to Greece, they go to these other places, and that same Babylonian worship continues. Herodotus, who is an ancient historian of that time, says, all of these people in Egypt, all of these people in Greece, they all have their own myths, but it's the exact same idol worship we saw in Babylon. And that's how you have kind of the unity of the same belief. There's different myths in Greece, like the Promethean myth. In Egypt, you have the myth of Isis and Osiris, but it's the same thing. And the bottom line is it's evil. It's that, if you want to say Satan, that is what Satan is in a nutshell. It's this representation in so many different other cultures, which I think is kind of an answer to when people say something like, well, okay, but how is there a Satan if no other culture is talking about him? He's in every culture. You just don't know what to look for. And that's the bottom line is that quote unquote Satanism looks a million different ways. It has a million different forms. And it's not that it's missing in other cultures, it's that you're missing it. By the way, I don't mean to not cite my source. That History of Babylon comes from a book called The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. That was written in about, I think it was 1853. And he was a Mason. So you can be certain that when talking about pagan worship of Babylonian idols, he has no incentive to do anything except tell the truth there. That's not an endorsement of Freemasons for those who are unsure. But that is the foundation of Satanism in a nutshell. It took many different forms throughout Europe. The Knights Templar, the Cathars, the Masons, the Illuminati, but that is where it comes from. I don't know if there's another direction you want to take that, but that is it in a nutshell.
That's so great. I think that I was telling you before we jumped on here, and I know I've talked to you a little bit in Twitter Messenger, but these foundations are really what tie it in for people to understand the reality of it. When people just hear a detail, like how you said, if they were to just be stumbling around somewhere, Googling something online, and all of a sudden come up on an article on, say, satanic ritual abuse or somebody like Michael Aquino abusing kids, they'd almost just write those things off and be like, oh, that's horrible that happened, but clearly that's just one instance, that doesn't happen anywhere else. That's so rare that something like that would happen, or it's so rare that there would be somebody in the military that would do something like this. To understand the foundations, I think really ties it in for people to be like, oh, this isn't just something that a random goth person decided to do because they're psycho. This is something that has literally been embedded into our culture since biblical times, and something that has stemmed, it's no different than how we understand Christianity for people who understand it, that it goes back far and it's embedded into our culture. It's not just something that somebody today or yesterday or 5 years ago was like, oh, I'm going to create this thing. This stemmed from actual events. It stemmed from actual people and belief systems that were formed from the beginning of time, basically.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's really funny because like on the rare occasions that I do talk to anybody about these things, one of the kind of cop outs that I get is basically just like, well, that's just like Catholic propaganda. Like, this one case, this one thing is a lie, or this one source is whatever. Here's the the overarching point, which is that satanic doctrine is so robust. It's actually more robust than, in many ways, and I don't mean this as blasphemy, I mean this to say the Bible has, it spans over so much time, but in certain ways it might not be as dense as the history of Satan in so many cultures. And the fact that it is so dense makes it's kind of like nailing Jello to a wall, is like the way that I put it. It's like, okay, there are Egyptologists that spend their whole lives studying Isis and Osiris, and that's one that doesn't tackle Greece, that doesn't tackle the Knights Templar. And I mean, like, to do any of those, it's such a mountain of effort to convince anyone to begin with. So I guess the point I'm just trying to make here is that when you do your research, once you pass the gates and you realize there's no going back, you realize it's so dense that it can't not be real. And I think kind of the once you get into or past the history of the establishment of Satan, you have to start looking to its practitioners to gain a more contemporary, to orient yourself into how these kind of things happen. And that inevitably leads us to secret societies and their doctrine. And I mean, I've done a lot of writing on this as of late, but I can just start off by saying secret societies are secret for a reason. And that is because their beliefs are completely at odds with our society. They are at their very core opposed to free society. And whether or not they will admit it, they are satanic. Secret societies are satanic. And I mean, there's no shortage of writing to prove it. And I don't think you can talk about modern satanic ritual abuse and secrets. I mean, no, actually, I know you can't. I'll kind of do the same thing real quick and kind of work backwards. But, an example that comes to mind is Aleister Crowley, who I don't know if you've talked about him, but
no, not really. I haven't talked this topic. It's like names have come up in conversations, but I haven't actually really devoted time to talking about all the history and like who these people are that people might hear of once in a while, so I appreciate you.
Oh yeah, no, and more than anything, I just don't want to give the overview to be redundant, but Aleister Crowley was, I mean, it's hard to like encapsulate the man because I mean, truly, I guess you got to quote, give the devil his due. He was very busy. He was very active. He was at root I guess you would call him magician, but I mean, he founded his own satanic religions, again, quote unquote satanic. They're not there. It's the textbook example of not really knowing what Satanism looks like. But he was a member of many magical secret societies, such as one called the Golden Dawn, which it came out of a group of Freemasons. So that's important. We'll touch on that later. But he revolutionized most of the doctrine of this group called the Golden Dawn, which does worship Satan. I have their textbook here right next to me. Actually, I got their self-initiation textbook and I read it. It's gut-wrenching, but they do rituals to Pan. They do rituals to Lucifer, and they talk about sacking the holy city and these sorts of things. He was a dynamic guy, Aleister Crowley. He revolutionized the Golden Dawn. He revolutionized this other society called Ordo Templi Orientis, which they claim descendants from the Knights Templar, the group of monks that were involved in the crusade, and they very well might be descended from them because the Templars have their own baggage. But they're a group of Gnostics who are involved in sex magic. It's a secret society that has 13 degrees of initiation. And I was actually just reading about this the other day. I actually stumbled upon it accidentally, but their main ritual is this thing called the Gnostic Mass, which is in all actuality a satanic black mass. It's just that you can find it on Wikipedia instead. You know, that it's quote unquote family friendly via the name. But what the Gnostic Mass is it's a reversal of a Catholic Mass, and it's just made to be as blasphemous and profane as possible. So they do a communion similar to how they do in a Catholic Mass, but they eat, instead of eating like the wafer, which is understood to be Jesus's body, they eat what's called a cake of light, which is basically a cake made of menstrual blood and semen. And they recite a ritual. And I mean, you can pull the ritual up on Wikipedia. I would encourage you to do so and read it because I don't have it pulled up in front of me. But it uses just a lot of really sickening innuendos, and maybe they're not innuendos, maybe they're literal. But when they say certain things, like it involves a naked woman, by the way, let's put that in there, a naked woman on an altar. When it says certain things about rubbing the master's sword, and there's like, you know, I don't know if it was just like it was written with a sense of humor, but it's really kind of nasty. But where it really, really gets bad is the fact that it writes in that the ritual involves children. And it's a sexual ritual in nature. And the ending of the ritual involves Baphomet, another Satan iteration. But the final thing that the ritual says is, now there is no part of me that is not of the gods. And now that is not Satanism as we understand it, because he didn't say Hail Satan. He didn't use a pentagram. But that's Gnostic. And Baphomet's involved. And it's designed to make you the god. So my question is, how is that not satanic? And so these are the kind of, that's a good way to kind of give you a bird's eye view of Aleister Crowley. And I mean, he was involved in many religions. He kind of moved from place to place because, I mean, even for a Satanist, he was kind of a crummy guy. A lot of Satanists themselves couldn't stand him. And so he kind of burned a lot of bridges. He ended up getting hooked up with L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, which I always think is so funny, because it turns out that L. Ron Hubbard was a huge acolyte of Aleister Crowley. Again, it's not funny, but it is funny in a certain way, because, you know, Scientology is just made out to be this really kooky religion that hooks celebrities, but its doctrine is actually satanic. And I mean, if you ever read the memoirs of L. Ron Hubbard's son, Ronald, he changed his name to Ronald DeWolf. He talks about his dad owning a 5,000-year-old book. I believe he says Babylonian, but I think he says a 5,000-year-old magic book. And he talks about his dad. You have to read his memoirs, if you can find it. he says, and then Dad opened the gates of hell. He opened them right there in front of me. I felt sick. I saw Satan. Again, tell me magic isn't real. This son, he had nothing to lie about. He says, I saw Satan. And Dad said, now you know the power that I have. He also talks about his dad admitting to drugging him and hypnotizing him, among other things. It's a very sickening memoir, and L. Ron Hubbard was a really sick guy. Long story short, Aleister Crowley and these sort of like modern occultists were all part of this group known as the Occult Revival, which kind of happened probably starting about the 1850s or the 1870s with people named Eliphas Levi and Helena Blavatsky, they were all just students of this kind of ancient doctrine. And I mean, if you read Helena Blavatsky's book, I believe it's called Isis Unveiled, she's talking about the same stuff. That's the thing you have to understand about these is it's completely unintelligible whether or not it's Michael Aquino writing it or like an Egyptian scribe writing it in 200 BC. They all believe the same thing. But the biggest practitioners that led to this occult revival were groups like the Freemasons and the Illuminati and all of these secret societies. And what I can't emphasize enough to the people in the audience, these secret societies are secret because they're teaching these ancient mysteries. They're religions. They're not mysteries, but they call them mysteries. And I mean, Masons themselves will tell you that in sort of veiled language. They'll say, we're here to disseminate the ancient mysteries to our brothers, to enlighten them, which is a semi-harmless statement on the surface. But if you ever read Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, written by Albert Pike, who is the Sovereign Grand Commander. A lot of Masons would call him the greatest Mason of all time. There's multiple statues of him in Washington, D.C. He makes it very clear that the Masons are Gnostic and that they're anti-church. They're opposed to the church. I shouldn't say anti-church. That sounds very teenage. But they say things like, in reference to Dante's Inferno, they might say he reversed the Catholic dogma in the most perfect Gnostic way. He used the devil as a ladder to reach the light. And so that you can't brush aside. You can't brush, like, they can say something very harmless, like, we want to illuminate our brothers. But then when you talk about using the devil to ascend to the light, you're kind of past the threshold of ignoring. And these secret societies, whether it's the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, they all believe the same doctrine. And many of them were all members of intertwining groups. Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati, was a Mason. There were many Masons that were brought into the Illuminati. They all believed the same thing. They were all educated in the same doctrine. Adam Weishaupt was educated by a Manichaean Gnostic. His mentor was named Colmer. He was a Manichaean Gnostic who studied in Persia. I feel like almost when discussing this, it's how many examples can I bring up where XYZ evil person turns out to be a Gnostic, but that's the truth. It's like, I don't mean to repeat myself. I don't want to be redundant, but so much of this story is just about showing you how many examples can I show you that it's all coming from the same place.
I think that's ultimately important for people to understand, period, even with something like just trafficking. Patterns are always very telling in something being true that somebody can't see with their naked eye. If you can show a pattern that's true time after time, that repeats itself, and that's common among people involved with something, then, like you said, how can it not be true? So I appreciate you bringing that up. It's it drives it home, showing what you're saying actually, exists and is the way that you say it is.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I mean, I guess the at least for this first episode, the thing that I want to hammer home is that these evil people are not, they don't think of themselves as evil when they do the things that they're doing. They think that we are evil. They think that they are enlightened. They think that they are themselves becoming gods. And they think that we are foolish and wicked, and that it is their job to transcend us and to dictate what it is that is good and what it is that is evil. And they do that by doing the most evil things that they can imagine to the most innocent people, to show that they are not weighed down by conventional morality, that they're able to dictate to themselves within a divine will what their universe involves in. And so it's not just as simple as saying these people who are hurting these children are thinking, yes, we're evil. They're not just villains that, like, you know, they're not bikers. They're people who believe that they are serving God, except God is themselves. And they do it with the same conviction that someone like Billy Graham serves the hungry. And so they believe that they are following a mission that's as old as time, and that they are doing what is good, and they are doing so with the convictions that they one day will be gods themselves. And it's everywhere you look, and it runs deeper than you think. I'm almost like at a loss for words, because when you really look at the picture in the full lens, it truly kind of does leave you speechless.
Well, and I love how you brought that up. That's something that it's very easy when you learn about this. And we're all, it should be a natural reaction to get angry and to be like, these people are so evil. I can't believe that they do anything like this. You know, it's being enraged and infuriated is a natural reaction. And we should have that and hold these people to that standard and be angry that there are people abusing innocents and children, women, you know, and that they are unconscious to it. But that's a key point. You know, I had a guest on my show, Sfolly, who is an ex-programmer. And that's one of the points she tries to drive home, is that these societies are led by unconscious people, that evil is unconscious of itself. Otherwise, evil could not be committed. People who are conscious of evil like us, you cannot be conscious, be faced with something evil and not recognize it. You have to be unconscious to do these things and to participate in them. You know, and it's such a deep indoctrination. Like you said, this has been going since the beginning of time. So for them, this is something as real, as believable, as noble, you know, and something they want to be as loyal to as followers of Jesus Christ have their convictions for that. And I think that's a very important point, because that's something too that I think people, they struggle hearing this, thinking, how can this be true that this many people are participating in something like this? And there couldn't be this many people if they were conscious that what they are doing is actually evil, you know? And so that's really important. I appreciate you so much being able to explain that in such a simplistic way for people to be like, okay, you know, that it starts to make sense whenever you understand the ideology and theology and how this historically has manifested itself for so long in people.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope I did a decent enough job explaining it. It's the one thing that's true about discussing these kind of things is you resort to the kind of conspiracy theory meme of pointing to everything linking together, and you know, working on the fly, trying to make things as simple as I can without leaving things out, it's turning out to be a little tougher than maybe I expected. But I do know that I will be coming back, and I inevitably, as soon as we get off, I'm going to go, oh, there's that thing I forgot. I will write them down, and we will talk about them again. But yeah, this is it's a beast, isn't it? I mean, you know as well as I do that
It's so much, and if you could, you did mention satanic ritual abuse and children being involved. Would you be able to go over how you've seen that manifest itself in these things? Like
oh yeah.
why children, and why is that important? And like, where did that come from historically?
Mhm.
If there's somewhere that you can mark that, hey, this has been going on for this long, or, it seems
Yeah.
like sacrificing, in a really weird way, that's biblical too, and even though it's different, it's like the God that we Christians look to sacrificed his son, and even though that was for a completely different reason, sacrifice itself is biblical, and we understand that, understanding our own thoughts, even if we're completely ignorant to Satanism and to, the opposing inverted way that sacrifice is being used.
Yeah, okay. Let me it's always hard to figure out where to start with these things, but
Oh, I think
uh
it's so, like, I love seeing men talk about these topics too. There's not enough people talking about any of this, but this movement in general, just, there's women leading the way, and it's so neat seeing men and seeing people your age jumping in and being like, hey, I want to offer my contributions to this, and I'm curious about it. So I'd love to just hear anything that you've learned about that aspect of it, because it is like children, and that aspect of it is such a huge part of what secret societies are built off of.
yeah, no, I mean absolutely. Well, okay. I'm going to start back with Temple of Set real quick. Because I do believe that, first of all, we know these things are very vast, and they're domain dependent. Um, I think one thing that needs to be kept in mind with Temple of Set is that Michael Aquino was involved in U.S. Army intelligence. And the Presidio military base has been an area specifically where really suspicious things have gone on. Some of the murders during the Zodiac killings, which were, by the way, a satanic cult. We'll touch on that next time, because that's its own crazy story. But a major function that of child trafficking, child abuse, is compromising government agents for the sake of owning them. And a case specific to that comes to mind is Craig Spence, who was he was more or less a government pimp of underage child prostitutes, who used to give midnight tours to the boys at the White House. It's a crazy story. I wrote a thread about it, but um, basically what Craig Spence would do was he was a pimp of underage prostitutes. He would get these prostitutes from, if I remember correctly, it's foster homes, but I might be wrong on that. He would fly these boys out from Omaha, and they would attend parties thrown for foreign dignitaries primarily. There'd be cocaine. The boys would go into the rooms with the agents, and there would be a camera, of course, and probably like a double-sided mirror, so that way these foreign agents could be compromised because there'd be blackmail on them. That's a very common component of any sort of abuse adjacent to government function. And I do believe in one way or another that was a function of Temple of Set, because I mean, Michael Aquino claimed before he died that there were many members of Army intelligence, Navy SEALs, government agents that were all a part of Temple of Set. And I believe so I do think that a lot of those rituals were used for blackmail. Also, it's just a good thing, quote unquote, good thing to blackmail people that are at these events, to say like, well, you can't say anything now, can you? On a more doctrinal level, I think specific to Temple of Set comes one of their core beliefs, which is antinomianism. Sorry. It's just the concept that by actively rebelling against conventional morality, we reach a higher morality. And I think that's the overarching theme of specifically child abuse is that it's the most heinous thing that you can think of. So it's a statement against life. It's a statement against humanity and morality. I do think, I mean, human sacrifice has been a motif in classically satanic, meaning actual devil with horns, going back to like 1000 AD. And I think that does have to do with the mocking of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Aleister Crowley, he has this one specific quotation when talking about one of his rituals that I believe he says, oh, it's something like, a young, perfect boy is best. And then he says something about, I think, drinking blood. I don't quote me on that, but the sacrifice of children, sacrifice, abuse, however you want to make it, it comes in different forms. And I mean, if you read Tim Tate, you get the impression there's a certain amount of these satanic cults that are really not, they're just crazy. Like, they're not exactly purists, for lack of a better term. They're people that live out in the woods that probably have a magic textbook or something like that. And they, they kind of take it to their own extremes. One specific one that comes to mind, there is a cult run by a guy named Gerald Cruz. I believe it was in Sonoma, California. It might have been in like Marin County. That's not really that important, but it was in the early 1990s. And he used to do like just really insane things. Like, he would like hook people up to like electric cords and like shock them and stuff. And there was like less evidence that he was really involved in child trafficking. But my point here is that like there's no book specifically that says like to do this or to do that. A lot of these people, they're just sick and twisted, and they pick things that are opportunistic, because a lot of this is crime for crime's sake, meaning that well, I don't want to get caught, so what are my realm of possibilities? Some of those the stories in Tim Tate talk about like two daughters with their stepdad, and like he would like kill a homeless guy in front of them or something like that. I think the number one motif, if we're going to speak broadly about child abuse specifically in satanic ritual abuse, is three things, which is the purity of the children. Children, obviously, they're pure, and the need for evil. It's the most evil thing that we can think of. And then three, this is kind of like a more under the radar thing, and that it just so happens, this is why it's so pervasive, is that children don't make good witnesses and they don't speak well on the stand. There's countless, this as well as I do, there's countless stories of children saying, well, there was a tiger there, or there was a lion or a shark or whatever, and that, well, that's not a very credible testimony, is it? But okay, they were doped up on LSD, and the people that were there were in animal costumes growling at the children. It's a 3-year-old child, and maybe they're doing so because this is specifically an ancient ritual. And I mean, there are ancient rituals that require people being in animal clothes, but a child would be able to testify if they could speak effectively, but they can't. And so I do think, for a lot of reasons, a child is a victim of choice simply because nobody believes them.
And like you said, the stories are so crazy, even as adults, when they get recall of maybe memories that they lost as a child, or if they start to deprogram some of the layers that go into, creating a traumatized child through all these rituals. And, that takes us down a whole different rabbit holes with dissociative identity disorder and things like that, and reasons why abuse may be important from that perspective too. But that is a problem, because these things are so extreme. They're stuff that you'd think that you'd only see in a movie. that when people hear one specific story of this maybe leaking or getting out, or one random case or one random survivor, even if it is the way that, even if it is somebody saying, hey, I recognize that I was drugged up and this is what somebody was wearing and doing, it still sounds insane to think, why would somebody drug you, first off? And why are they even wearing a costume? What does that have to do with anything? Like, it just sounds so out there. And like you said, they think of these really crazy things, and some of it may be passed down generationally and maybe traditionally from many years ago. Some of these rituals might be ancient and they are following textbook, but that is part of it, is doing things that are so off the wall crazy that it's so easy for a person that has never been exposed to this to immediately write it off because they associate what they're hearing with a Stephen King book or a Saw movie that they watch in the theater. It's fiction. That's not real. That doesn't happen. And if it does, it's just a one-off case. And thank God that person's in jail, or, it's one person. People have no idea that this is consistent across the board in these societies, that this is a key part that goes on no matter what cult it is, if they're following these rules and guidelines and adhering to these historical beliefs, that this is consistent. This isn't just one little cult off in the forest. This is all over the world. Consistent.
I'm so glad you said all that, because you got my juices flowing again. I thought I was tapped out, but I got a little more. I think the first thing that it's something that I wouldn't get a tattoo, but if I did, it would say this. David Berkowitz said this, and there's an excellent book that was written about him by a guy named Maury Terry, and I think it was in the 1980s. It proves that the Zodiac Killer was a satanic cult. Amazing book, an amazing piece of journalism. But David Berkowitz said the reason that satanic cults are so pervasive is because the public is so afraid to admit that something so big could be going on right underneath their noses, is that they'd rather not face it. And that's exactly why these type of things go on right under the radar, is because the absurdity of them. And I mean, I know that we could converse just about that. Before I forget what I was going to say, the other thing I think it's really important to note, because we talk about specifically about the elite being involved in these things, as opposed to your high school janitor, is that the doctrine that leads people to stumble upon these kind of things is inherently elitist, for a lack of a better term. It's people that are smart enough to look and find these things, because I mean, I had to seek it out myself to find the existence of it, to actually come across the material, and to then understand it, and to be able to enact it, and all of that. It takes a substantial amount to give the devil his due, intellect, to even comprehend these sort of ancient things, and to then act upon it. You have to be especially ruthless, and so you kind of have a perfect profile, for lack of a better term, of people that are very intelligent and are very ruthless. And I think we both know that being intelligent and being ruthless is the perfect combination to be very elite in society. And I also just think it's worth noting a lot of it's kind of oblique, and I'm kind of just like hitting the shuffle button here, but a lot of states did acknowledge these sort of things were a problem. And it's really weird how it's kind of left the public conscience in the last 20 years, more or less. I mean, I believe it was Massachusetts voted to ratify a law against satanic ritual abuse specifically, and they even defined it somewhat concretely. But that's gone. And I mean, I believe that Los Angeles even funded the Satanic Ritual Abuse Task Force, but that's gone. So I guess it's not even just that people don't know about it, because people definitely knew about it 30 years ago. I mean, it was on the news. I mean, on the news, where they don't talk about anything. But I do think people forget, because with a lot of these things, I mean, I can't tell you how many things I've come upon that, are crazy. And I wouldn't have found them unless I dug religiously. And yet there's no good reason. It's just that nobody talked about it again. Um, and that seems really shocking for the topic that we're discussing because it's very life changing. But I do think it's worth the one thing that even like a lesson I could take away from myself is we have to talk about it because people will forget. So that a lot of rambling there, but that was a lot of thoughts I felt would be good to get out.
No, that's great. And that's so true. You know, you can even look at something like MK Ultra.
Mhm.
We know that that was true. There's
Yeah.
documentation that the CIA participated in that all the way up
Yeah.
until the 60s is when they stopped documenting it. And it seems like after that, that's when people started to forget. And so if you have one generation that maybe heard about that as an adult, maybe they were 30 whenever it was the 60s, then they have kids who have kids who have kids. By the time it's today, that's not anywhere talked about, you know, from now until the 60s. Like there's people today that weren't even, you know, I wasn't born back then. So it's like, I have to actually go physically out of my way to see that that existed. Where now, if you hear about it, it's like, oh, this Hollywood star is under MK Ultra. And it's like, okay, what is that? That's not real. But that's where people stop. They don't go say, was it at one time a thing? Like, is there somewhere in history that it actually was documented? And that's
Yeah.
important, is asking those questions and then doing a search on stuff like that and saying, it sounds crazy and I haven't heard about it in my lifetime. It's not something I learned about, but could it have been around mainstream when my grandparents were around or when their grandparents were around or even, you know, 100 years ago? Was there some type of documentation that something like this existed? And that's where what you are teaching is so important because you're pulling those things from history and reintroducing them to people who don't even know that they should be asking a question
Mhm.
about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's a weird position to be in because we're kind of at a square one, you know, because we're just fighting the battle to get people to understand that it's a problem. And I mean, like, just kind of as you were talking about that, like, I was just thinking a bit about like, okay, you accept that a phenomenon is real. Then at a certain point, if everybody agrees it's real, you would think they'd do something about it. And we're just still fighting the battle to get people to even want to do anything about it. Um, Meanwhile, it's like, you know, I do a little Google search here and there, and it's like, I see the signs in the news. I see that it's happening again. You know, when 15 goats are found gutted with their eyes and organs missing in the middle of the desert in El Paso, Texas, they're not there for no specific reason. And I'll give you a kind of a really specific example to me. There was when I was growing up in California, there was a bridge, or I guess it was more of a road. And I live out in the middle of nowhere, by the way, with a cult in town, a known cult. So that's important context. But this there was like a long drainage ditch that went underneath this road to prevent flooding, and it was always known as the Demon Horse Cave when we were kids. And so one day, me and my friends, because we were very much just rambunctious and kind of the Hardy Boys, we went searching in this cave, and um, you know, we're scared, and there's certain things that are alarming and all of this, and we get to the middle of the pipe, and I see this pile of mutilated animals, and I was just scared because I was 16, and I just wanted to get out of there, you know. But I was, you know, I remember there's specifically being some symbols on the wall, and I remember there was something specific about these animals. And you know, you do enough research from police reports 8 years later, and it turns out that that was a satanic ritual site, and those were mutilated, gutted animals, and there was pentagrams on the wall of the cave. Um, so that was an area where satanic rituals of animals, which, you know, people chalk that up to like quote unquote low grade Satanism. Like they would say that's something that that's where you get the idea of like, oh, just a childish kid, right? And that may be so. But nonetheless, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's everywhere. And it's, you read enough of these, like the Office of Jurisprudence wrote a 65-page report on Satanism and sacrifices in like 1992, maybe something like that. I'll send that to you so people can have it if they want. But at the same time, the FBI was saying there was no proof of satanic cults existing. Local police officers all across America are writing these 60-page reports talking about where to look for satanic cults, the symbolism they would leave in the dirt to signify how to get to a spot, graffiti, the fact that they would leave booby traps on paths for specific, like, so if someone was looking for a spot, they might step in a bear trap or walk through razor blades. Obviously very kind of gutter things, but my point is that local police stations all across America were diagnosing this, and there were some very great detectives, albeit ones who learned on the fly. They didn't receive any formal training, that taught themselves how to look for these things, and they never passed that knowledge on to the next generation. I mean, there's a handful of books that I've read that disseminates this knowledge. Like, one that comes to mind is called The Satan Hunter by Thomas L. Wedge, who is a police officer. But it's right there. It's right there. I don't mean to be somewhat schizophrenic about it and say it's all around you, but in a certain way it is. In a certain way it is. And if you just actually dig and find out what the symbols look like, they're not everywhere. They're not everywhere, but there are a lot of places, and they're pretty easy to find if you know what you're looking for. And all it takes is for you to pick up a book and figure out what language they communicate in. And it's very abundant. And it's not super complex. I mean, yeah, there's a few symbols that, like, if I see them at like really heinous kind of quote unquote New World Order gatherings where it's like, I'm like, okay, that's very clearly ancient Sumerian, and I'll maybe never understand what that is. I can't decode that. But people know what a pentagram looks like. People can figure out what an obelisk is or what a scarab beetle is. And it sounds very psychotic, but I do think everyone should come away with this conclusion that you ought to look and figure out what signs of satanic activity are. You ought to teach yourself, and you ought to teach the people you care about, and you ought to be looking for them, because before you know it, those people enter a community, they don't leave. They don't leave, and they cause damage, and they're hard to find. Nobody will believe you. And if you can find them, they will try and kill you. So it's the worst kind of imaginable disease to a community, but you can teach people in your community to look for it, and you can show people that it's important they speak up. And so I would recommend, like I said, I will put as many links as I can think of for people to get all these things to educate themselves, because truly it's not about me being the source, because I'm not anything special. I'm just a guy who cared and did the reading, and you can do the same reading that I did, and you can learn it just as well as I did. And you should use it in your everyday life in the sense of protecting the people you love, because that's ultimately what this is all about. I'm just trying to help people arm themselves.
I love that so much. That is really what it's about, and that's what I think for me too. That's been one of the biggest takeaways from this. I've been doing my podcast. A lot of my friends watch it. I had a friend just yesterday. She was sitting in line waiting to pick her son up from school, and the truck in front of her had a Freemason license plate and had the Mason, the little I don't even know what the
called a square and compass. It doesn't matter, but yeah.
It had like all these, bumper stickers of it on it. It had the Confederate flag, wearing it loud and proud. And even the little decal around the license plate said Mason on it. Like, he's identifying himself as that. And the actual license plate itself had the Freemason sign on it. And she was like, I would have never known to look for this,
Yeah.
I hadn't, watched your podcast and like actually took time to learn what some of these symbols mean. And it's like, not that noticing a license plate is going to change the world, but imagine the difference that could make, just that little thing. If now you know to keep an eye out for the children that are getting out, and like maybe being aware of who's around that person, who is in that vehicle, like what do they do for a living? Are they in my community? It's
Yeah.
little, it's starting small that changes the world. It's not doing everything big at once. It's saying, how do I keep my family and my community safe? How do I recognize if this is happening? When I go to a sporting event, am I on my phone, or am I kind of looking around and seeing what's here, who's watching the kids, and like, are people safe in my community? Am I safe in my community? Are my children safe going to school? We can prevent a lot of things. We might not be able to change the world, but if we can save a child's life, if we can keep one person that's dangerous from entering our community and possibly harming somebody, those small steps change the world. If we all took
Yeah.
time to do that and took time to see what we're actually seeing, I look at the world now after learning all of this and I'm like, how did I never ask a question about that symbol that I've seen a million times? I've just always accepted it, that that's normal, and there's nothing normal about what that is. And I've seen it so many times that I've never even thought to ask, what does that symbol mean? Or why did
Yeah.
they choose that particular thing? So I really appreciate you coming on here and giving us this 101 on what you've learned. And you are very special for doing this. You're incredibly special, and you did fantastic. For people who don't know, this is Matty's first podcast, and I would have thought that you've recited this a million times. You talk with such authority and so well and so eloquently. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. Would you be able to give people a little teaser of maybe a few things that we'll be talking about next time?
Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate all your kind words. I don't want that to go under the radar, because I definitely scrambled to prepare. And I mean, I know a lot of this stuff kind of like the back of my hand, but I wasn't so sure how it would go. Though I'm very happy with how it went. So I do really appreciate what you said. Um, as far as things that we're going to talk about next time, yeah. So off the top of my head, we're going to dive more into the kind of the true crime aspect of a lot of these higher order child trafficking operations, for lack of a better term. There's some really kind of crazy and incredible ones that history has ignored. We're going to talk about really kind of some of the first satanic rituals that are ever recorded, and they're recorded with members of the royal French family. And then I'm trying to think. There's one more. I just kind of want to talk about bloodline cults, because
Yeah.
a lot of things that we're talking about the fact that they go on behind our noses for generations. And there's a really special story about a guy named Henry Lee Lucas, who is probably the most prolific serial killer in history. He admitted to killing, like, I think it was something like 600 people. And his accomplice was a guy named Otis Toole, who was part of a satanic death cult in Texas. Like, his family would sacrifice children and these sorts of things. And they were kind of a match made in heaven, because Henry Lee Lucas was abused by his mother, and his father was bound to a wheelchair. And so he was beaten savage. Like, they're like two of the most like damaged people in the world. And they kind of just met accidentally. And they were like, well, I guess we just go on a murder spree. And I'll end it with this, because I don't want to spoil the whole story, but he was pardoned. Henry Lee Lucas was pardoned by a man who you might know, named George W. Bush, the former governor of Texas. So it's a hilariously evil and sad story. It's only hilarious in the sense that you're like, how did I not know this? And how did people not freak out? And I kind of just want to end you and my talking, because I've talked a lot, with a really kind of odd anecdote, because you just touched on the Masons and people in the community. The first moment I ever had kind of thinking that the Masons might be a little bit strange, I had an English teacher who everybody knew was a Freemason, my senior year of high school. And he used to teach us like these exact same mysteries that I was discussing today. I didn't learn that until I learned what they were. But people used to always ask him stuff about Freemasonry, and he would say, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. And it was only when I found out that the Masons do kill people for knowing their secrets that that ever took any sort of that really started to make me curious. So yeah, I'm really glad to find out that I can do these podcasts and come up with enough things to talk about. I promise that the next one will be even better, because now that I've got one under my belt, I know how to do these. So
Well,
yeah.
it's hard. We never know, it's like that with almost every guest that I have on. We can have a strategy as much as we want, but there's so much information to cover with every single topic that you don't really ever know where it's going to go. And this was so great. I even learned a ton. This has been a topic I've wanted to dive in. I focus so much on speaking with survivors that I get a lot of my time researching goes into researching their story and who they are, and watching their interviews and reading their content, to prepare for stuff like this. So actually learning the foundations is something I haven't even gotten to do. And even whenever I try, it's like you said, a lot of the literature, it's not easy to find, or it's just not available unless you're paying $1,000 for a book, and that's also not very applicable for me to do. So it's tough learning these foundations, but it really ties in and it brings home all these different stories that people have, and it brings legitimacy to the little bits and pieces that people hear but have trouble comprehending that something could actually exist on this level across the world, and that these things do happen. So I appreciate you so much, Matty. I knew as soon as I saw you pop up in my feed, and as soon as I started digging in your content, you really are special. You might think for you that you're just somebody that took on a hard task, but that's how a movement starts. That's how people are educated on things, is one person has the courage to say, that's a little bit against what mainstream says, and that's a hard topic to digest, and it's sad, it's emotionally and energetically draining to learn about this stuff, but I'm going to take the task to do it, and I'll share what I'm learning. That's how we create understanding of hard things, is by somebody like you being willing to do the hard work and research and find these sources and find this information and deliver it to us. So I'm so grateful for you, Matty, and I'm excited to dig back into and expand on these conversations in the next couple episodes. In the meantime, where can people connect with you if they want to follow you?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much only active on Twitter at the moment. I plan to maybe dive into a platform that allows for a little bit more long form writing, because I'm starting to write these projects that take 6 weeks to research, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to write 3,000 words on Twitter. But at the moment, you can find me there on Twitter. My ad is Big Sur Lifeguard, BIGSURLIFEGUARD. And this is just kind of a housekeeping thing, but if there's any text specifically that I referenced today that you need, that you'd like to find a copy of, please just shoot me a DM. I have almost all of them bookmarked, and even if I don't, it doesn't take me long to find them. I would love to help you. If you have a question about anything, just please, I'm very reachable. I want to help people. I want to push knowledge forward on this topic. So yeah.
This is awesome. And everybody listening, what he's saying is true. I literally didn't know him, reached out and was like, you need to go on my podcast. And we've been talking ever since. So awesome to finally get you on. I know we've been talking for a little while.
Yeah.
So valuable. And I'm so excited to continue this. And for people listening, go on Matty's page. He has his threads, and I'll link them down below too, so you guys can find him more easily. But go share the thread, read it, share it with somebody that you think might find value. These topics are hard to talk about. It's not something many of us are educated in, and it can be really overwhelming, just like how you saw on this episode and how you see on all my episodes. It can be overwhelming to even encapsulate what you're learning for somebody else to digest without, wanting to spit it all out at once. And people like Matty are doing a great job in taking information, condensing it into palatable pieces and putting it into a presentation piece that somebody can easily read and get kind of a, get their feet wet with some of this information and find sources where they can dig in deeper. So I encourage you all to please go support Matty, support his work. He's putting a lot of time, like he said, on one project, he spent 40 hours researching one person's content. This is a lot of work that he's doing, and he's not profiting from it. He's not getting anything from it except, educating us. So the least that we can do is go support him and share what he's doing, especially because the algorithms aren't very friendly with pushing information on Satanism to the top of search engines. So we need your help getting this information distributed. And same thing with this podcast. If you support it and if you found value, go share it with a friend, introduce them to Matty, let him break down the information if you don't know how to do it, or if that's a big task for you to think about. Do that with our other episodes. Go dig into all of our podcast episodes, subscribe, like, share, comment, tell us what you like, what you didn't. Connect with us on social media, donate to us. Everything helps with, it costs money to even do this podcast every month. So every way that you guys can help support us, it's going to allow us to be able to provide more resources for you to learn and helps keep us going. Also link below, I'm going to put the Save Our Children podcast, which is my sister podcast with Becky and Bridget. They talk on the parenting side of living in a red-pilled world and help navigate taking all this information into your household, how to teach your kids, how to heal your inner child. And they really expand on the information that I have here. And I also have our website below. We just added a merch store, which I'm super excited. That's also going to help fund this project in all of our podcasts and help us fund and resource survivors also. So support us in any way you can, you guys. And we'll be back next week with another episode with Matty. And I appreciate you guys, and we will see you then.